We have a very exciting and diverse panel lined up today to talk about the challenges and opportunities of using new technology tools to improve forest monitoring. And I'm hoping we can have a little bit of a provocative conversation about how we can best leverage these tools to achieve our goals. So technology has come a long way since the time when forests were just a glimmer in climate negotiators' eyes. And for context, I'm going to do an informal survey to illustrate the progress that we've made. Out of curiosity, how many of you have ever used Skype? Raise your hand. Hopefully, yeah, all of you. All right, great. How many of you have used Google Maps? Perhaps you used Google Maps to find this hotel. I know I did. I would be lost without it. And how many of you have an iPhone? Fewer of you. I know. Fancy. So for context, when the UNFCCC was created in 1992, Skype and Google Maps did not exist yet. And in 2007, the year when RED was formally incorporated into the COP at Bali, that was the year the iPhone was first launched. So we've come an incredibly long way with technology. We're doing things now that we never thought we could. And forest monitoring technologies are no exception to this trend. All of the policy mechanisms discussed in the past 2 days, whether it's pay-for-performance RED+, forest moratoria, zero deforestation commitments, all of these things require accurate, transparent, and frequently updated information to monitor progress and help course correct when policies fail. And recent technologies offer an unprecedented opportunity to produce this kind of detailed information at all scales, whether that's using airborne LiDAR to quantify carbon stored in trees, or handheld devices that enable local communities to map their territories, such as Abdan has been speaking about in various panels. So one of the most exciting advancements for forests is actually happening hundreds of kilometers overhead in space. There are over 1,300 satellites orbiting the Earth right now, and many of them are Earth observing. And the number is only expected to increase in the future, with new companies launching satellites and governments launching new satellites as well. And not only is the quality and the quantity of satellite imagery improving, but so is the accessibility. For example, in the 1980s, it would cost you, some of you might remember this, hundreds or thousands of dollars to download a single Landsat scene and analyze it. But in 2004, for example, the US government released the entire 43-year time series of Landsat, and people put them on servers, which enabled an incredibly powerful sea change in the way that we could monitor our resources from space. And one example of this sea change, many of you may be familiar with this work. Matt Hansen at the University of Maryland, together with Google, processed over 143 billion pixels to produce the first ever globally consistent map of forest loss annually from 2001 to 2014. This data, of course, has its weaknesses, but it was the first globally consistent but locally relevant picture that we ever had of forests. And platforms like Global Forest Watch are making it more accessible and more transparent than ever. And closer to the ground, technology is also evolving. Drones are no longer just toys or military tools, but they're actually being used by conservation organizations and even governments to quickly monitor areas that would be too costly to patrol on foot. And even closer to the ground, local communities and indigenous peoples are using mobile technologies to map their lands and to collect information that's useful for inventories or even monitoring the safeguards for RED+. And we know that this technology will only continue to improve, giving us finer and finer pictures and a better understanding of what's happening to our resources. But the question I really want to focus on today with our panel is, what is needed to link this information to action, to embed this new technology into decision-making processes and decision-making structures, and improve the capacity to utilize this information? And to help us reflect on those questions, I'd like to invite up our panelists to come sit on the stage, and then I will introduce them. Great. So we have a very exciting panel today representing voices from civil society, from government, and from research organizations, all of whom are, I'm happy to say, friends. To start, we have Tasso Acevedo, who is the coordinator of the system of emission of greenhouse gas emissions and the Map Biomas project within the Climate Observatory in Brazil. But of course, he has worn many hats And previously, he was the head of the Brazilian Forest Service and also helped to engineer the program to combat deforestation in the Amazon. So in short, Tasso is a very big deal, and we're excited that he made time to be with us here today. Pak Koni is a good friend and the country director of the WRI Indonesia office. He initiated the One Map movement and moratorium during his tenure as chair of the task force on REDD+ within the President's Office of Indonesia. And I asked Pak Koni for an interesting fun fact about himself, and he sent me 2 public positions he holds, which are incredibly long and sound incredibly complicated. So what I got out of that is Pak Koni has very little time for fun, but he's involved in a lot of really important work. Pradeepa is an environmental economist who is the head of planning and development of the Guyana Forestry Commission. She has led the design and implementation of Guyana's fantastic national monitoring and reporting and verification system, and has worked with the Guyana Forestry Commission since 2002. And finally, we have Rhett Butler, whose job is way cooler than all of yours, I guarantee. He is the CEO and managing editor of mongabay.com, which is an environmental and conservation website that hopefully many of you know. He also recently launched an effort called Wild Tech to explore how conservation can better leverage technology. So a quick round of applause inviting our panelists to the stage today. Great. So Tasso, I want to start with you. So yesterday you spoke a little bit about this first miracle in Brazil. So Brazil reduced its deforestation rates by around 80% in the last decade. And some people would point to the rapid deforestation detection system called DETER that the Brazilian Space Agency produced as a key element of helping that miracle happen. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about the role of technology in helping bring about that first miracle and some of the enabling conditions that had to be in place for that technology and that data to help create those outcomes.
Okay, thank you for the invitation for this panel. Let's say first the context. Now this was 2005, 2003, 2004. The system was designed, the idea, and implemented in 2005. So that was early days. Even the discussion about like free satellite images was kind of a very something very new. What's the question at that moment was we were having this information from PRODIS, which is like the system that gives information every year about the deforestation, but it was like 2 years later. So it was like you publish in 2005 the information of deforestation 2003, something like that. So for the people that that were developing this plan to combat deforestation was basically, it's too late. I mean, we can't get the information that late. So so there was this request to INPE to think about something that we could have just as an alert. And the way it starts actually was just thinking on fire. So the idea was like, as we had maps for fire, very frequently, they said, why don't we just take these maps on fires and try to find out some connections? And then the people said, well, it's in certain regions will work, but in others will not work because actually the fire will come much later than the deforestation when it happens. And it's just a very specific time of the year that this happens. So they decided to create this the system, which basically works with the free satellites that we had at that moment. I think it's MODIS in the beginning, and then this Brazilian satellites, and thus show up with this idea to the team in the government, say, well, that's what we can do, but actually we can't give numbers. Let's say if we just can give a map saying that there is like the places where there might be deforestation, but will not have like numbers because we know that it's not precise and etc. And so we have this whole debate about what's the use of that we will have for those maps. And ultimately the decision was to put it out as not just the maps with the points, but also put the numbers attached to that, even if we know that this is like probably much less than what really was happening because the precision was much lower. So the second debate, so the first thing was interesting is if you have a number, if you have the information, put it out. I mean, just don't try to kind of, because you don't trust too much, then you don't show the number. Let the people judge that. The second thing was interesting was the debate about whether this should be published right away or this should be something used internally by the government. Say, okay, we have this detection system and then we have the environmental agency, the IBAMA, that will go there and catch the guys doing the bad things. And then we have this, interesting debate that took like 45 days or something. And then finally the decision was like, just put it out, because it's as much people have this information in hand, they will create pressure that we need to actually be in the ground, look into the things, and etc. So I think the second important piece was this openness to have this as soon as is available to be out to the public. And the third piece was that the information should be available not just as a map itself or something that you can see, etc., but something that you can download, you can take the raw material and play with that. So I think that those are the three elements that were new for that moment on thinking on mapping and monitoring, etc. Something that is information that you have, just put it out. Second, just make available to everyone so they can play with that. And third, make available in a format that the people can actually use this information to do other stuff, even the ones that maybe you don't like or that you don't want. So that I think was the three moments that we have that point. And just to see that this is really related to the way you take decisions, is that the fact that somehow in the last 3-4 years, some of these early decisions were kind of reversed somehow. So for example, the tier used to be for every month. So every month you have the information out, etc. Today's, now the policy is like every 4 months. And it's every 4 months, but then the environmental agency get this 1 month before. And then, so there is I think it's a kind of a step back on the way we were using that information. But it's good that we have, now because the system was very open in the beginning, other systems were built up using the same technology. So we have SAD, we have independent systems also doing the same thing, which is the cool thing. So.
Great. And a quick follow-up question, if I may. So in your panel yesterday on Brazil, you mentioned, so we've achieved this first miracle, but you were focused on how do we get to the second miracle of going to zero deforestation by 2030. And of course, the systems you just mentioned, PRODIS and Deterra, only monitor the Amazon. That's one biome out of 6. So what does the technology look like in the future for Brazil to get to this goal of this very ambitious goal of zero deforestation by 2030? And what kind of innovation can we expect? And do you think that those numbers will also be made public?
Yeah, I mean, well, first there is a lot of independent systems in place in Brazil right now. So we have at least for 3 of the biomes, we have independent organizations doing their mapping system. So we have SOS Mata Atlântica doing the Atlantic rainforest. We have Amazon doing the Amazon and so on. We have this initiative that I'm coordinating with 15 organizations on what we call MAP biomes, mapping land use change in all the biomes in Brazil. But now the government just announced like 1 month ago, finally, that we will have like the same collection of systems we have for the Amazon, which is like a detection system, early detection system, a system to monitor annually the deforestation, and then a system to give information of what happened with the land after it's clear cut. So it's kind of the story of the land afterwards, which they call Terra Class. Those 3 products will be available to all the biomes by 2020, which I think it's very far away. I think probably the main difference we have now, comparing to the previous years, that back in 2005 that was the case, is that very few organizations were able to actually manage the data, get the information, produce the maps, and produce the information and make it available. Okay, and so at that moment, the point was like how those organizations could make this as most transparent, easy, and etc. the thing that's changing now is that actually the paradigm now is that anyone could actually do the same thing. So the things that we have to do is to put out platforms and systems that allow people, any one of us, to actually choose what satellite we want to use, choose certain algorithms to make any classification, etc., get the information for whatever is the region you want to work, and so on. So you are less than a specialist on GIS, on remote sensing, etc., and you are more a specialist in a certain area or subject. And this is just another tool, like you have word processor or things like that, that you can use to do the monitoring on one. And that's and that's just one piece, which is like monitoring with maps. But I think that technologies to do to work on monitoring involves much more things than just mapping. But thinking on mapping, this I think it's the next step. Is to we don't have to wait for a specialist to actually do the whole thing. We will have tools that will allow any one of us to actually do those maps.
Great, thank you, Tasso. So moving on to Pakoni. So the last slide that I showed in my introductory presentation showed an active fire at a 30 centimeter resolution, so very fine, small enough to count individual palm oil trees. And you looked at that and you said, uh-oh, that's Teso Nilo National Park. And I'm interested, so WRI has been monitoring the fire situation in Indonesia with real-time data for a couple of years. So has the Indonesian government and the Singaporeans. And I think it's interesting that despite having an abundance of data and information, we saw an incredibly impactful fire season in 2015. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to that gap between information and action. So having the data is necessary, but not sufficient. There are other pieces in that value chain. And then to the extent that you can, relate that to the way that technology could help or could not help the implementation of things like the moratorium, the commitment to restore 2 million hectares of peatlands by 2019. So tell us a little bit about the situation in Indonesia.
Okay. First of all, thank you for having me here. And the series of questions that you pose is needed more than 4 minutes.
Right.
So I'll try to be as brief as possible, but still clear. So yes, starting from the fire on 2015, yes, of course, it's a terrible situation, and our government managed to put some people to court, but in the end, they got away. That tells us that we need to work more on providing evidence. Global Forest Watch able to pinpoint the location of the fires, but it's not clear on the contextual data that come with it, with the location. Of course, we have data coming from the government on concession, but it needs more than that in order to be able to come up with a good evidence for the court. So the next thing that we need to do is actually to go to the ground and find out what kind of evidence that cannot be denied in the court. And to do that on the ground, we have to involve as many actors on the ground as possible, so that the proof that they gather, of course, it will involve technologies in it, be that drone, be that GPS tracker or something, to come up with the hard evidence. We are now undergoing, let's say, a piloting in Riau. It's close to Teso Nilo, just to get a better understanding on how the land management in relation to the commodities, in particular palm oil, doing their business on the ground. What is the supply chains? Where is the gap within that supply chains? How can we identify that and then come up with a monitoring system that could provide us with that kind of data? So with this pilot, we hope that we can find the pattern, and then try to use the pattern within Global Forest Watch, so that we will then know what kind of information that has to be there and how can we get that information based on this pattern. Yeah. So this is how we try to put technology into use, in this case on law enforcement. Can it be used to monitor moratorium? Yes, of course, we can. But then again, it needs cooperation coming from the ground, again. Yeah. So the government already coming up with standard operating procedure to allow people to provide data. But it's still work in progress. Yeah. We need to work more in formalizing this to be able to be adopted by our formal regulatory framework. Yeah. We are progressing quite good, but yes, we need to wait. Yeah. Hopefully, this year we can come up with that kind of system that allow us to for the people to participate and provide us with more granular data on the ground, yeah, to monitor. One thing is just moratorium. We have a lot of things that can be monitored using this kind of approach, like biodiesel supply chain, for example.
Great. Did you want to respond, Tasso? Are you sure?
I was thinking another thing.
Okay, we can come back to you in a moment.
Okay.
Let's move on to Pradeepa for now. So as the Prime Minister mentioned in her opening remarks, Guyana has made incredible strides in building a robust monitoring system that can be used for pay-for-performance, RED. But I'm curious, can you talk a little bit about that process? You know, what were the enabling conditions that allowed Guyana to basically go from scratch to having a system that meets international standards? And what were some of the conditions in terms of financing and partnerships and technology that were needed to make that, and maybe some lessons that other countries could take away from that process?
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you for coming to this session. When we started our work on the MRV in 2010, there were many things that were not present within the national framework. So for one, there were many kinds of data available, but these were disaggregated. So for example, there was forestry data within the Forestry Commission, there was mining data within the Mining Commission, there was agriculture data within the Agriculture Agency, there was indigenous titled land data within the Guyana Lands and Surveys Commission. So many pieces were there, and I recall Francis's analogy of the jigsaw puzzle. That just reminds me of what Guyana was at that time in 2010. So there were many pieces there, perhaps not in the exact way that would be required to form an MRV, but certainly very disaggregated. So that was one of the hallmarks of our starting point. The other hallmark of our starting point was that there was a vision, a political vision for RED and a policy vision for RED, but the technical platform was not there. So there was no lead agency, there was no roadmap to take the steps forward as to how do we even begin to think about mapping using satellite imagery? How do we integrate carbon data within this framework to give not only spatial results, but also forest carbon emissions and removal numbers? How do we integrate the community level within the framework of the national monitoring system? So that was one of the hallmarks as well. There was no institutional framework for the laying out of the steps forward for RED. And of course, there was not a clear pathway forward as well as to what do we do systematically to take the steps forward. And thirdly, I would say what was one of the hallmarks of the 2010 period was that there was no set reporting structure that we can sort of aim to start thinking about. So what do we really report? What are the standards of verification that that report should be subject to? So what should be the benchmark or the outcome that we aim to achieve? And that was unknown as well. So those three, I would say, hallmark points of context in 2010 was what we were beginning with. So I'll just speak briefly on how we've been able to overcome each of those and what have helped us to overcome each of those. So I'll start with the second first, which is the institutional framework and the roadmap of taking it forward. At that point in time of 2010, fortunately, we entered into a bilateral agreement with the government of Norway. And that enabled us to start seeing in a clearer way what would be required of an MRV type of system for a performance reporting measure to be developed. And one of the first things we did was the development of an MRV roadmap. So we collaborated with support from the government of Norway with Professor Martin Herold, who came to Guyana and was able to help us develop a 5-year roadmap that laid out systematically what is to be done, not only technical-wise, but also institutional-wise. What needs to be done given what we have in terms of data capability, institutional capacities, human and physical, and also the structure of the Norway Agreement, what that demanded from the system. So we laid out a 5-year roadmap that outlined the systematic steps that we were to take us to the point of reporting. So I would say that really helped us to think through in a clearer way, a doable way, a realistic way, and not be overwhelmed by the gargantuan task which really faced us at that time in 2010. So that really was, I think, the first step forward in knowing what needed to be done to produce an internationally credible system. The second step, which is linked to the first hallmark of the situation in 2010, was the disaggregation of data. So one of the things the roadmap sought to do in the very initial phase was to find a way to bring this data together in a central platform and to have that hub be within the Guyana Forestry Commission, which was identified as the lead institutional agency. So that allowed for each of the agencies to still do what they were doing for their individual mandate, but to share this data for this additional purpose, which is for reporting on an MRV type of system. So we set up an MRVS steering committee, which allowed for each of those agencies who had and who have an involvement in RED to be part of that committee to share data and to speak about how we plan and map the steps forward. So at that point in time, data sharing became a regular undertaking. So that, I mean, it seemed quite simplistic. Like even as I'm talking about it, I'm thinking, so why was it not done before? But you know, some of these things, it seems clearer when you're doing them, but you know, it just was not done before. And everybody was just sort of minding their own business and going about their individual mandates in the way that, you know, they ought to be doing. And the third aspect was what do we use this system for? So what is it we aim to achieve in aggregating data, setting up the institutional capability, and really bringing the roadmap into implementation? And there again, I think the Norway Agreement came in at the right time, the Guyana-Norway Agreement, because in the absence at that point in time, in 2010, of a reporting framework of exactly what is expected from a pay-for-performance kind of system, the Guyana-Norway Agreement set out what is called RED Plus interim indicators. So we report on 6 indicators: gross deforestation, intact forest landscape, illegal logging, forest management. And the MRV was built around reporting on those aspects of interim indicators, and built in a way to not leave the system static, but to incrementally add new elements to the system as we move forward. So for example, we started with reporting just on deforestation. By the 3rd year, we were reporting on certain elements of forest degradation. We started off using 30-meter resolution imagery in 2010. By 2014, we were mapping the whole country with 5-meter resolution rapid eye imagery, which allowed us to really refine the kinds of products that we put out. And throughout all of this, I would say one of the things that I think really drove the system forward and allowed for it to be, I think, as dynamic as it has become, is the ownership by the local agencies. So for example, there is less and less consultancy involvement in the routine work of the system. And at national scale, we, the local people, at the level of the national agencies, are doing the work. So there is little involvement of NGOs or international partners in actually doing the routine work. There is still consultancy involvement. We collaborated with Winrock International and Indufor in the early days, and still so, in integrating new design features within the platform of the MRV. So like currently we're looking at ways in which we can advance our reporting on forest degradation. So I'll just say one last aspect that I think really took us through from the 1st year to the 5th year, the point we're at right now, is I guess sort of similar but different to the case in Brazil. We could not just put out data that we would complete after an annual period of reporting. Because the reporting is used to trigger the payments under the Guyana-Norway Agreement, it was necessary that everything we did and the product of that reporting for every year be subject to independent third-party verification. I guess the V in the MRVS. So from the very inception, even though we were in the embryonic stages of the development of the MRV, and I'm thinking back to 2010, how uncertain we were and how scared we were to face a verification team. We have our lead verifier here in the room. DNV has been the company that was hired to do the verification for each of the 5 years. The verification process for Guyana included the checking of the methods which we applied to generate the results and the auditing of that result, including field verification of the processes that were put in place to give that product. So until that last stage is completed, which is the signing off on the results and the methods we've applied, only then is the payment made to Guyana. So in that way, we monitor, we put out a report. That report is subject to independent verification, and then payment is made. So for every year, we have corrective actions from the verification process. I don't think there was ever a year that we did not have corrective actions.
We have a head shaking.
Yeah,
up
no,
here in
and
the front.
he's
All right.
saying no, yes. But what we can say is that for every year after the previous year, we have to show how we have successfully addressed each corrective action. So it's kind of like an FSC sort of system, but for an MRV kind of reporting. So the verification is there to ensure that it is not just reporting based on what we think is best, but what indeed is advisable based on a set standardized system for reporting. And the last point, one of the things that the verification checks for every year is that new elements as laid out in the roadmap continues to be integrated so that we never really remain static in the implementation. And they also check that indeed when the questions are asked, they're never asked to the consultants, at least not over the last 2 years. They're always asked to the local teams. So one of the tests, I think, the true test of the rigor of the ability of us to implement the system is how well we can stand up to the scrutiny that the verification team brings. And there are corrective actions sometimes, and we have to build on those. So it's not perfect, but I think the main thing that we aim to achieve is incremental, progressive improvement in building the system as we go ahead.
Great, fantastic. Thank you, Pradeepa. Rhett, I'd like to move on to you. So I have to admit, you're a bit of an odd one out on this panel. To my knowledge, you're the only media representative here as a participant, and not just here as press, covering the event. So I'm curious, I have a two-part question for you. Firstly, what is the role of environmental journalists in this sphere of REDD+ and zero deforestation commitments and the myriad other things we've been discussing? And then secondly, how have you been using technology to do that job better than before? And maybe some examples of that.
Sure. Yeah, well, so my view on journalism is it's a way to increase transparency, which then supports better accountability. And so journalists ask questions that scientists don't ask, that NGOs don't pursue, and governments, can't really ask. And so that's kind of the role that journalism plays, and technology has helped enable us to extend our capabilities. So we're able to do things now that we weren't able to do before. And not that I'm a shill for Global Forest Watch, but we do use Global Forest Watch a lot because we report on forests. And so when Global Forest Watch was launched, I thought, wow, this is an amazing platform, incredible data, but how do we actually tell the stories behind the data? So we can see that West Kalimantan had a protected area that lost half its cover. We don't know why that happened, who was responsible for it, and what's going to happen next. And so I thought, well, maybe we could have journalists dig into that data and tell those stories. And so I wanted to first ground truth to see whether that would work. And so in 2014, I went to Aceh and North Sumatra. And this all started with me being in my apartment in California, just on my computer. And I'd identified a point in a protected area where there were pink spots popping up. And those pink spots are these short-term alerts, kind of like Brazil's system, potential deforestation. And again, within this protected area, there's a lot of oil palm around there, so I thought, well, maybe it's oil palm. So I went there and visited, and it was, there's a lot of suspense. We found this illegal road. We followed the illegal road. We had to get out and walk, and as we're walking, we're stepping over piles of elephant dung. There are orangutan nests, remnant orangutan nests in the surviving trees, and even tiger tracks. And then we come over a crest, and then all of a sudden this huge oil palm plantation with freshly planted seedlings, so in the previous 3 months. So this all started with me in my apartment, and there was this destruction that went on, and we were able to document it. We had a film crew with us, and so I thought, wow, this actually works, and so we should try to do this more broadly. So we launched this partnership program with Global Forest Watch, and we've now done almost 350 stories in 50 countries. And so we have journalists who are poking around Global Forest Watch and looking for interesting stories. So technology is enabling us to both identify stories, but also fact check stories. So in the past, you'd get a report from an NGO making certain claims, and you'd sort of have to take it for face value. We could interview some folks, but at the end of the day, it was kind of hard to often get facts on the ground, especially if it was someplace very remote. And so it's been very useful for that. Also with governments. So governments may make certain claims, and we now are able to check. It's almost like a third-party verification system. So from that standpoint, these technology tools have been very useful for enabling journalism to increase accountability in the forest sector.
Very cool. See, I told you his job was cooler than yours, right? Was I wrong? Fantastic. Well, before we go to the second round of questions, Tasso, you seemed so inspired earlier. I don't want to miss the opportunity for you to mention what you were thinking about.
There was many things, but one that just come up when listening to the presentation of Guyana, it's interesting how different is the dynamics when you are, let's say, when you are under the heavy pressure of deforestation, or whether you are actually monitoring the conservation, which is more or less like the big difference of our system. So if in Guyana, the pay for performance is to not have the deforestation, because it's very low.
Right.
So it's not don't increase and keep it very low. And in our case, it's basically, what we have to do is stop the damn thing, As we said yesterday, although we decrease 80% of deforestation in the Amazon, not in the other biomes, what we have today is that we still have the largest rate of deforestation. We're champions. But we don't want to be champions, so you have to face that. So that's why it's very important that every information we produce and we can have, it's actually out. It's like a paper, you can make the work, and then you have this nice science, and you have to wait to publish the paper, and then there is 3-4 years waiting for the people to know what you're doing. And the other way to do is okay, there is this paper going, but we have to put it out. So I think this is the circumstances don't allow to us, I think, to have, to have this pathway. And in somehow, I think part of what we see, we always have this debate in Brazil, and then part of the people actually thinks that we have to wait until we have everything totally perfect to do, which I'm totally comfortable with that. I've worked with FSC certification as a certifier and etc. for many years, so I understand really well this whole thing. But I just don't think that we should. I'm not saying that you're doing that. So I'm just saying that people don't get the lesson this way, that we have to produce something that can pass on the verification. That's not the goal. The goal is to produce something that is useful for the people that are doing the day-by-day job to act. And by the way, one of the things that we need is to actually have something that is verifiable, so you can have the payment for performance. So it's not not catch it wrong. And the other thing is just to add is that there is obviously a lot of emphasis on the mapping stuff, but I think we have to broaden a little bit. There is tons of other tools that has been developed recently. I think there is a lot of work now happening on the tracking systems. All sorts of tracking systems. From the guy that has this thing that can track the chainsaw with the satellite or the phones or whatever. But there is something. Things that are very concrete today. So Peter, that's here, is developing, for example, a system that is basically telling the story of any piece of wood in Brazil, where it comes from.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's basically just playing with the information that is already there. So the key factor on this, and I think when we are in the position in the government, when we have the chance to be there, is that how can we make the information that is there available to the people to play with? So there is all this information about the licensing, the forest management license. There is all the deforestation authorizations, and then you have every time you transport the timber, you have like an information on that it's provided, electronic, etc., and it's all there. But it has to take someone that will actually take this information and try to think and organize that in a way that it's very simple for anyone to get a piece of wood and say, what is the documentation of this? And then from there, you can use a lot of intelligence to actually come back and see if it's possible that the claim that this would come from that place, etc., it makes sense or not.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this will happen for many things. It will happen for cattle. It's happening for. It will happen for palm oil because of all these commitments that we have, etc. So I think that's this other types of tools will have to be thinking and accommodate on the way we are thinking, and the best thing we can do when we are in a position that holds information in governments, one, it's just make this thing available to the people, and they will find a ways to actually organize this on a way that's useful for us and for the society now.
Great. Pradeepa, did you want to respond to that?
Oh, yes. So I think, Tasso, we agree more than we disagree on the points that we've made. Certainly, for Guyana, it's a REDD+ country, so we aim to show that the deforestation rate remains low. But that does not mean to say that we don't have drivers of deforestation. So, for example, we have seen over the 2012-2013 period that gold mining has peaked to a point where it has tripled the historic rate of deforestation. Although low at 0.056 in 2010, it went up to 0.08 in just 2 years, in a span of 2 years. So with the rise in price of gold on the international market, that really is driving as well the continuing trend upwards and downwards in the deforestation rate for gold, for mining. So, I mean, although we have had and continue to have deforestation rates that have been historically low and continues to be low, I think it's going to be reckless of us to assume that it will always be that way. So the MRV, the way it's positioned right now, is to allow for that, I would say, red flag that was put up in 2012, 2013, when the rate went from 0.056 to 0.08, for that now to feed into informing policy on what needs to be done to ensure that that does not keep increasing, and that we're not here 5 years from now talking about a deforestation rate of 0.1%, or something that really will be a source of concern. So the point where our MRV is at right now is sort of where I guess Brazil was at a few years ago, which is now to take that information to help inform decisions. So there are a couple of platforms that are now being worked on from the policy directive. So we're looking to see how we can use that data to help to reduce the impact of mining, or at least keep the impact of mining low. We're looking to see how the MRV can feed into ongoing efforts that Guyana has been undertaking on the European Union Forest Law Enforcement, Governance and Trade. And Tasso spoke a bit about tracking timber, ensuring that there is legality in timber. So the MRV now is being honed in to ensure that the definition of legality under the VPA, the Voluntary Partnership Agreement on the EU FLEGT, really draws in some of the data inputs and some of the results that FLEGT really demands to be present in a VPA. So I think the MRV coming at the time at which it came, which was at the early stages of our commencement of negotiations with the EU, and now that we are approaching the final stages of negotiation, I think we're seeing the greater value of the MRV in helping with the governance aspect of legality in timber tracking, as well as policy making for mining. We are now at the initial stages of contemplating becoming a candidate for EITI, Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, and I'm sure that when that point in time comes, that the MRV results will be quite useful in showing that the transparency indicators on the EITI really links up well with the story that the MRV is saying. So, for example, when we show large areas that are cleared that might not be under a legal mining permit, that of course would be a reporting element on the EITI. So I think that what we have now, we really are at the cusp of realizing the usefulness of the system that we have. We're using it right now to report for performance and to trigger payments under the Guyana-Norway agreement. But I think the potential of the system is so much greater than what we even realize presently can be had, let's say, 5 years from now, from the governance perspective and, you know, for a multiplicity of other political and policy-oriented things.
Great. Thank you, Pradeepa. I want to go back to Pakoni. So Pradeepa mentioned in the early phases of creating MRV in Guyana that one of the biggest challenges was having, you know, data and disparate places and not aggregated in one place. And of course, we know Indonesia is undertaking this One Map initiative, which is an incredibly ambitious effort to harmonize all these land use allocation processes. So can you speak about that process a little bit? It seems to me like one map is a bit of a misnomer because the map is not the most important thing. It's everything that comes before the map. So yeah, can you speak to that a little bit?
So, well, one map is actually a process whereby map is the byproduct. But the essential thing about one map is actually the process of synchronizing and harmonizing those geospatial information, data that is scattered around, and how to make it put it into one place, and then try to synchronize and harmonize. So back to that fire event, we know for sure that that is just a symptom. So if we come up with a strategy to suppress the fire, to prevent the fire, if you're not dealing with the root cause, then it will happen again. And one map is exactly the way we deal with that root cause, which is lies on the land governance. We do have data on concession, but as I said previously, it has a minimum contextual data that allow us only to interpret a very few analyses that far away from able to tell the story behind fire. So with this one map, what we are doing is gathering a lot of geospatial information and then try to put it in one place and then use this as a way to communicate between stakeholders. Then the indigenous people would speak using the same, let's say, indicative consolidated map. I say indicative because the communication is then put the map into a definitive stage. And this is the one map that we are talking about. So stakeholders would come there, private sectors, smallholders, even the local government as well as the national government has to be in one place and talking the same thing, the same issues, the same location, and then come up with agreed map, which entails agreed solution. Right? With that, then we will have a clearer path towards reducing or combating any issues on land use. Fire is just one of the symptoms. So that is exactly what one map is. So is the process. Does it require technology? Yes, of course. People sending data, people trying to synchronize data, all those are pretty much using technology. But the social dimension of it is heavy. So probably Brazil and Guyana has different angle on this kind of issues. For us, it's much more on social, economic, political aspect of land use, sustainable land use.
Right, absolutely. I think we could spend a whole afternoon talking about the CAR, the rural registry in Brazil, and challenges and similarities between the one map process and the registration in the CAR. But actually,
13,000, not 70. 13 something.
But I do want to move on to a question that I want to point at both Rhett and Tasso too. So we've mentioned, that in many countries they have robust official monitoring systems. Brazil, Guyana has their MRV system, but of course there are more and more independent monitoring systems. So groups, researchers, NGOs creating data, whether that's Amazon in Brazil with their SAJ system, Matt Hansen and other groups with their data. So I want to start with Rhett, actually. As a journalist, ultimately, I presume you're trying to tell the truth. You want to get an accurate picture of the story. So when you are faced with official data and then unofficial data, and these things may tell different stories, how do you approach that? And then what do you view as the role of this dynamic between official data and unofficial data as you're telling these stories?
Well, yeah, technology is definitely forcing competition in this space. So there's no longer monopoly on forestry data. So, in my early days, it was pretty much about, Brazil's the exception. They had the system, but had to rely on FAO data. But now FAO is being forced, forced is probably too strong a word, but being pushed to innovate in order to remain relevant because of all these other sources out there. Same with Brazilian government. So Brazilian government releases this data, but Amazon also is a competitive system. So if there's something that slips up in the Brazilian government data, then there's a check on it. But the three panelists here all have fairly advanced systems, but there are many countries that don't report accurate data, or and companies as well. So companies may say something that may not be accurate. So there's an example from a couple years ago with this company in Peru, which had claimed to not cut down any trees. It was growing cacao. Yet when you jumped on Global Forest Watch or another platform, you could see month by month the forest falling in primary forest. And so essentially that company had misled their investors and the public by making these claims about sustainability when in reality they're cutting down the forest. The same thing goes with government. So a few years ago, the chief minister of Sarawak came out and said that 70% of our forests are intact, which was quite a bold statement if you know Sarawak's history. And just jumping on Google Earth, it's not scientific, but you can just look at it and just eyeball it. You can see these logging roads metastasizing across Sarawak, huge forest loss. And so just posting a few images like that really tells a powerful story. So I see these new platforms as being really useful for providing a secondary check on the official data. So again, I'm not necessarily referring to our panelists here, but there are many countries where the data may not be 100% accurate. And so it's kind of forcing these countries to become more credible.
Great. Now I want to pitch it to Tasso, because you do come from a country where there's relatively robust official data, and yet you yourself are currently involved, for example, in creating an independent land use and land use change map called Map Biomas. So what do you see the role of independent monitoring systems in these countries that are producing relatively robust data?
Well, in this case, it's like it's actually this information is not being produced. That was the key thing. So we actually propose first to the government to do it. They do a map of the land use map of Brazil every 5-7 years to do the national inventory system. And then as we were doing estimation of greenhouse gas emissions, when it comes to land use sector, if you don't have maps for every year to compare, then it's basically we have to use deforestation as a proxy. And even information for deforestation we don't have for all the biomes. So our proxy was kind of a bad proxy. So we have the information. We publish the information that we have using deforestation as a proxy. But we say, well, why don't we have a map of the land cover, land use map of Brazil every year? If we can do for 1 year, why don't we do for how many years? And then what's interesting, this type of limitations we have in the government to understand it. So when we proposed this to the government, they said, you don't know what you're talking about. I mean, this takes, for us to do one of those maps, the full country, it's $3 million. 90 people working for 14 months to produce 1 year. Now you not just want to produce this every year, but you're saying that you want to have this historical, going backwards all the years back, forget it. It's not doable. And I said, well, why don't we, if we have all the money and et cetera, a lot of people, why don't we do it? So now it's not possible, it's too complicated. And it's not unnecessary. We can do this for every 5 years. So we said, why don't we do this automatized? Like, let's try to, we're using the new information. So the challenge was put to a group of people to think, if we have to offer that, even to the government as an option, what should be the design, etc. So one of the things that is interesting about try those things in the civil society today is that we have the access to the technologies to innovate and create those things. And we can take risks that sometimes the government is not willing to take. Whether it's because you can involve a lot of research and this maybe not work. I think that's one problem. The other problem is that there is, since the case of the data from the Snowden and stuff of
WikiLeaks?
yeah, so the whole thing it creates a kind of an atmosphere where in the government in Brazil it's not allowed. The government is not allowed to work on the cloud, so you can't process things on the cloud and etc. So if they want to do something like that, automatized, they have to rely on like supercomputers and stuff like that, which is not that you don't have the supercomputer. It's like it's completely different. So what we are offering is trying to develop the technologies and the tools to produce annual maps of land cover in Brazil that will help us to make better estimations of greenhouse gas emissions, but also will create a platform in a way to show that this could be done by anyone, and this could be used by the government actually to do similar stuff. So, but to do that, they have to face this problem, which is if you have as a rule that you don't work on the cloud, you are creating a limitation to yourself, right? Because it's there, and it's an interesting dynamic. It's like, okay, you don't work in the cloud, but do you use Google? Yeah, Google is like you don't have control, right? It's there. Do you use internet itself? Like if you type anything, it's coming everywhere in the cloud. So it's kind of a strange thing, but that has to do with this idea of control information. So I think this is another let's say another lesson of why it's important to have this, the society just and the academia and etc. creating things, because once you create those new tools, then it's visible. You can see how it works. It also helps the people in the government to have the good argument to say why we don't have this thing working, which is exactly the point we are right now with Mapiomas, because we are showing to the different agencies and the people are saying, well, why we will not use the same tools that they are using and for free, which is kind of a more interesting. So anyway, so
great. So for our final question, unfortunately, we don't have any indigenous peoples or local practitioners on this panel, and we've heard many of them in this event so far speak about the importance of involving local communities and getting their lands on the map and using new technologies to help do that. And of course, Pradeepa, Guyana has experience in working on community forest monitoring, MRV with communities. So could you speak a little about how we merge those top-down approaches to MRV for RED with bottom-up approaches, and not only that, but how do we scale efforts at community forest monitoring?
So our approach in Guyana started at the national level. So we defined what is going to be monitored as forests based on the definition in the Marrakesh Accords to be applied at the national level. We set the platform for carbon stratification, or carbon map, at national scale. We identify the drivers of deforestation at national scale as well, but including consideration of those which prevail at subnational level. So certain fundamentals were set at national level, and those inform the national MRV. And I think the reason why I point to that is that I think that helps to then segue easily into the development of CMRV, which has been one of the lessons we've learned. So in 2012, we had our first major push at the CMRV, the community MRV, subnational type MRV methods applied in Guyana, whereby through funding from NORAD, we were able to have the leadership of an NGO organization in Guyana, which worked with the North Rupununi communities. Those are communities in the north of Guyana, 17 of them, to help to use the standards set at national scale, but apply those at the community level. So for example, they would define forests based on the parameters set at national scale, so there is that consistency. The imagery acquired at national scale will be used at community level, so there is not that additional cost for them to go and seek out imagery. So their role really became test checking what the national system really gave out. So they're using the results at national scale. So like we did these maps of each of the 17 communities, and they ground truthed those maps using phone technology, working with a UK-based company called Global Canopy Program. And they were able to use our maps and sort of, in a way, validate our maps. So they found some inconsistencies in some cases to say, look, you're mapping this area as deforestation, but really it's cloud cover that you couldn't see. So we were conservative and we mapped it perhaps as deforestation. You map this area as a road, but it's not a road, it was a track to lead to a settlement. So they, these 17 communities took our maps with the drivers of deforestation laid onto that map and ground-truthed that map with the technology that GCP helped them with at the community level. And then they bring that information back to the national MRV. So then we were able to look, oh, there's an inconsistency here. Oh, this one is correct or this one isn't. And then those match seamlessly because we're using the same definition of forest. We're using the similar data source and we're using the similar kind of stratification. So there were not that bridges that we had to cross to then align them. Those were aligned from the beginning. So like many people criticize that kind of approach that, you know, you start at national scale and then try to find a way to make it relevant at community level. But I would say being involved from the start that were I to do it again, I probably would do it in the exact same way because I think it lessens the complexity of having to find best efforts to, and maybe we might not find best efforts to align these fundamentals when we come to scaling it down to community MRV. And I would say secondly, one of the things that that approach helped with as well is the lessening of cost at community level. So for example, the community level did not have to buy Idrisi software that we used to do the carbon stratification map that allowed for us, you know, like all of the high technology stuff. They would be doing the aspects where their skills are, which would be to verify our product to say this is not shifting cultivation by rotational shifting cultivation, it's pioneer shifting cultivation. So the real technicalities of the ground-based knowledge is what the CMRF will contribute to, and not the things that we can do, which would be, you know, to invest in the buying of the satellite imagery, to set up the carbon stratification, to work through the defining of forest and those fundamentals. But that does not mean to say that some of these can be tweaked in the future. So I know that WWF currently is working with some communities, again, in the Rupununi region of Guyana to find ways in which we can expand those lessons learned from the North Rupununi 17 communities to other communities in the south of Guyana, maybe to other parts of Guyana as well, to see what else we can do to ensure that really we can replicate the main results of the national MRV at community level. And I think it'll be interesting to see what that brings over the next couple of years. But our main goal in Guyana is to find a way. Yesterday I was listening to Per speak about the willingness to pay right now is for forest carbon. So although some of the CMRVs are looking at monitoring arapaima, which is a fish in Guyana, monitoring spiritual sites, monitoring areas of archaeological value, those are integrated in the MRV, but one of the main things we're looking at is the forest carbon aspect. Because the willingness to pay, whether we like it or not right now, is for forest carbon. So, for example, if there were to be a second bilateral with the government of Norway, the payment will, I presume, continue to be at national scale, and then the benefit sharing system taking place through that national payment scheme to subnational level. I was listening to the Mexico presentation this morning, and you know, it's a similar dilemma that they face with the payments coming to national level and finding a way to have that trickle down to subnational level. So do we use the same baseline? Do we use the same kind of reporting mechanism to monitor payment for performance? So those are the questions we are integrating within the solution finding structure of the CMRV. But one thing we keep an eye on in doing all of this is to ensure as far as practicable that there is a certain consistency in the way in which we apply the monitoring. Because never would we want to be in a situation where we are paying out more than we're earning. So for example, if we are monitoring deforestation at national scale and we're saying that on average over the past couple of years, Guyana has been losing between 9 to 11,000 hectares a year. So and that is for all lands, state lands, Amerindian lands, a very small percentage on Amerindian lands, of course. If that is what we're earning for that penalty, then we should not be paying out more than we're earning. So there is a great and urgent need to ensure that we do not lose track of the need to be consistent and the need to be uniform, and to ensure that the baselines are consistent but still reflective of the uniqueness that CMRV kind of monitoring would bring. And looking to see, I guess, essentially whether some of our main assumptions, like are the 5 drivers of deforestation which Guyana has been tracking, are those changing? Are there unique occurrences of maybe some other kind of economic driver that we're not taking into consideration? And those are, to me, the fundamental inputs that the community MRV will bring to the national MRV system.
Great, thank you. In the interest of time, I'd like to open the floor to questions. If you have a question, if you could please come up here to the right of the stage and let me know which panelist you're addressing. And please introduce yourself and your organization as well. Why don't we start here with this sir up in the front? You can come up here to the microphone.
Good morning, everyone. Myself, Ajay Saxena from Center for Science and Environment in India. In the RED Plus, actually, compared to the deforestation, the degradation part of the forest is more complex, especially in terms of developing countries like India, where millions of people are living inside the forest, and they are extracting biomass in the form of fuel wood, fodder, and other litter also, and everything. So I want to understand from Brazil, Guyana, and Indonesia, you have a similar situation. Do you have any experience about where you have used technology, not the classic ways of collecting information like surveys and everything, where you have used technology for finding information about the degradation part of the forest? So, and from Monga Bay colleague, have you done any story about the degradation part of the forest? Thank you.
Great. We'll take a few questions and then we'll go back to the panel. So a great question about the use of technology to monitor degradation.
Hello everyone, I'm Steve Lipscomb. I work with BBC Media Action, which is the international development NGO of the BBC, so possibly the second media person in the room, but we're probably a dying
I stand
breed,
corrected.
right? Yeah, very interesting panel, thank you very much. I'm specifically interested in public communication on this issue and the role that technology and data can play in potentially simplifying or telling a story that is a way to communicate around this that you know hasn't necessarily been possible before. And I'm specifically interested in your views. I'm not really directing this to anyone in particular, in how that can be done in a way that doesn't necessarily involve investigative journalism, because in a lot of the country contexts where where deforestation is an issue, you know, investigative journalism is incredibly high risk, and there often isn't the capacity to deliver that locally. So what kind of formats, or what are the opportunities, in your opinion, to leverage some of this data and some of this technology in public communication? Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So how can we tell a story with data and technology? Oh, well, you can both come up, that's fine.
Hello everybody, thank you for interesting presentations. My name is Uda Almos, I work for the Forest Peoples Program. I have a question to Pradeepa about Guyana, because your monitoring system, as I understand it, is monitoring the whole country. So I'm wondering, do you have a way of identifying the forest that is being cut as part of a mining operation, and that being cut as a part of rotational farming practices of Amerindian communities? And because, as you know, there is some contention around whether that should count as deforestation or degradation even. And also, I wonder, the monitoring system, have you had a national debate, or are you planning to have a dialogue on how you define rotational farming in this deforestation?
All right.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Hannes Böttcher. I work at Virchow Institute in Germany, a research NGO. Thank you for this interesting discussion. I'm working on a project on independent monitoring myself, and it's fascinating to see the many tools and data sets emerging only within the last year. My question would be maybe to Tasso. From a stakeholder perspective, it looks like uncertainty is thus even increasing, because I can find any number for a similar for the same region and same activity, because there are different institutions publishing different numbers. So how do I how can we provide orientation to stakeholders to find the appropriate data, and what indicators are useful? And maybe to comment already, accuracy might not be the most the best indicator, because it's sometimes also misleading. The most accurate might not be the most appropriate data for myself, my purpose. So how can we build trust in independent information without also labeling good and bad data, which is not good for building trust, I think.
Great. Those are 4 very rich questions, and we only have 10 minutes to answer them. I will quickly plug that after closing remarks, there's going to be a parallel session, actually 2. One is going to be focused on cool tools for monitoring. So we didn't talk about the technology tools in depth, but if you'd like an interactive demo, there will be an event up the street on that. And there also will be an event from like our German colleague mentioned, on independent monitoring as well. So quickly, let's see if we can get through these. So the first question is on the second D in red, the very elusive degradation. So do we have experiences in using technology to monitor degradation? I know the Brazilian government does with Degrad. So maybe we'll start with Tasso, if you can quickly comment on experiences monitoring degradation with technology.
Yeah, so there is Degrad, which is most of what's doing it's capturing logging. There is also Amazon is also develop a system to do something similar. The thing with degradation is it has to be very early. You can see the signs of degradation disappear very fast on the satellite. I mean, on what you see in the image. So that's actually one of the reasons why we want to have like the land cover, land use maps every year. And actually, there was someone sent me an email right now asking what's the difference of projects and what we are doing. So basically, it's the one is just dealing with a forest, non-forest. What we're trying to do is to have everything. So you have like forest, agriculture, pasture, cities, and etc. and all those transitions, and for a long time series. So one of the interesting thing is that one of the best ways to find actually understand degradation is first is frequency. You do this, you do it very quick, very up to date. So at most 1 year of difference from one image and the other and so on. But the other thing is if you have a long time series, then you can understand the process to know if it's degradation or if it's actually recovering of a forest, which is, I mean, the signs of the satellite is the same. If you see a forest that is degraded, it could be actually be regrowth. So the important thing is actually to have a time series in which you can understand what's the story. And I think the whole thing now is about telling stories. Even at the level of the pixel, which what we are doing right now. And that comes to, I think this comes to the piece of communication, as
Right.
The other question was about, which I think the whole thing is to understand the narrative. What's the story that we can tell? And so the way we present those tools has to be in a way that for anyone it's possible to capture and understand a story. It's not that easy, but and I don't think that we have been putting a lot of energy on that before, but I think most of the organizations working on mapping now is really thinking about that, I mean, Global Forest Watch, in our case, it's like, how can we tell this thing in a way that's so simple that anyone could actually imagine what's the story and can create a narrative that makes sense.
Great.
And that comes to the third point, which is basically, okay, so you want to have something that is practical for the people to use and that's to tell the story. Now, that could come to a point where who actually had the better tool to show the information will be like the information that will be used, regardless if it's the best information or not. And that comes to the third point, which I think it's, once you have tons of different systems providing information, how you choose. First thing I want to say is that I love the idea of having tons of maps. I'd rather have like 10 maps for one place than have just one. And then we don't, yeah, I mean, because you don't know. And then somebody says that this is the perfect map. So we really want to have like as much information maps can have there, and you can actually compare them and see. So one of the things that we find out by comparing a lot of maps, a very simple way to actually get a better sense of what's going on is that you just put one map over the other and see what's the frequency. I mean, all of those are saying that this is forest, or all of those are saying this is deforestation. That you can't be sure that this is actually probably a forest and this is deforestation. Just I think it's to have just one map. It's simple to understand because you don't have anything to compare. To have two is complicated, but if you have 10, 12, it's much
Very
better than have
complicated.
one or two, because then you can
Right,
you have more,
right.
of course.
I'll take a moment to pass it to Rhett really quickly because I want him to comment on this question of how do we tell stories around this information, and how can we do that even without investigative journalism?
Yeah, I mean, so technology's been a great tool for that, so visualization. So we use a lot of maps, so we use Global Forest Watch, and the great thing is you have all these different data layers, so you can, pick and choose and make it look interesting. There's also tools that are outside, satellites, so things on the ground, so like camera traps. So that can be a great way to illustrate a story. So, I mean, just recently there was a study that was looking, and this is not really forest related, but there were camera traps monitoring biodiversity, and they found that all the animal composition changed erratically 4 weeks before there was an earthquake. So it's just kind of an interesting story. I mean, it would have been hard to understand that without having this monitoring system in place. So there's also on-the-ground technologies that are interesting. There's also cool things with sound. So like there's this organization called Rainforest Connection that has these cell phones that are basically in the forest listening. And they thought it was great for monitoring gunshots and illegal logging, things like that. But it turns out they're capturing all this sound 24 hours a day. So you can just log into the server and they can create soundscapes for ecosystems. So it's another way to sort of look at these issues. You can see, when certain species are active, when they disappear, rainfall, things like that. So all those are kind of tools that are interesting for journalists to kind of dig into without having to have people on the ground. The other thing that technology does is it allows you to actually reach people on the ground. So you can talk with people who are in the forest now, where before you'd have to send a journalist into these places. So that's another change. And I would just comment, that we've done a lot of reporting on degradation. It's a big issue, and Brazil has a system. There's also LiDAR-based systems that are now mapping on a smaller scale degradation, and so we cover that a lot.
Great. You're giving me the I'm done, but this says a minute and a half. Can I give the minute and a half? Okay, I briefly want to give Pakoni and Pradeepa a chance to respond, so to the extent that you can in this brief time.
Good. So I'll add. Also mentioned about having many maps is good, but for us in Indonesia, many map is also good as long as you have or you use a standard, standardized metadata, for example, to know that this map is generated because of this purpose, doing this kind of method and so on and so forth. So yes, okay, it's fine to have a lot of maps, as long as you use a standard reference that is the same. That is essentially what One Map Indonesia is all about as well. Thank you.
So just very briefly, on Oda's question on mining and shifting cultivation, yes, we can certainly tell the difference. The way the standard operating procedures are set up for the mapping, the spectral signatures are totally different from mining and shifting cultivation, so certainly we can differentiate them. For some of the drivers, it's a bit of a gray area, but not for mining and shifting cultivation. Those are quite clear. Actually, mining is clear from everything else because it leaves the holes, so it shows up as blue. On the aspect of rotational farming, so I guess the question sort of intrinsically is, could we tell the difference between rotational shift in agriculture and pioneer shift in agriculture? I'll tell you, Oda, that was one of the questions we got a corrective action request on by DNV in our last audit, that we need to do some more work on that. We are contemplating ways in which we can merge them, or maybe if we separate them, but the thing that we keep bumping into is that we need a longer time series, and is pointing to Tasso's comment earlier that to really sensibly monitor shifting cultivation, we need at least a 15-year time series to see how these mosaics around, especially rotational shifting cultivation, how these are forming over time. So I think it'll continue to be a bit of a struggle in the coming years, but hopefully we become more clarified as we move ahead. One thing I'll say though, that we are absolutely certain that it is not a drive of deforestation. So it's just a way in which we can account for this in a cycle kind of reporting, or whether it's reported on the forest degradation, but it is one of the areas that we need to do a lot more work on, and hopefully one of the newer features of the phase 2 of the MRV.
Great, fantastic. Well, unfortunately, we have to wrap up. My sense is that this is an incredibly rich conversation. We could be here for the rest of the day. So I highly encourage you to look into these site events that are occurring later today. Nancy and our colleague here from the German Institute, will you raise your hands, both of you? You as well, sir? Yes. So if you're interested in continuing this conversation, talk to one of these people about where that will be happening. Because I don't have a lot of time to wrap up, I always think of the E.O. Wilson quote, we are drowning in information yet starving for wisdom in the context of this sphere. Because as has been mentioned, there are increasingly more and more maps and more data about what's happening with forests, but the question is, how do we synthesize it, and how do we make policy relevant insights and insert that into decision-making structures? So I'm really grateful that the panelists were able to comment on that today. Let's give them a round of applause. All right.